As we explored in my Top 30 Dungeons & Dragons Adventures video, see link in the description, Module T1, The Village of Homlet, and its delayed sequel T1-4, The Temple of Elemental Evil, comes in at my 9th favourite. With the release of Original Adventures Reincarnated No. 6, which revisits the aforementioned village and temple, I thought I'd do a bit more of a dive into the original adventure and Goodman Games' reworking of it for 5th edition D&D. Before we start, there are spoilers ahead to the original modules, the Goodman Games Reincarnated Edition, the Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil module, the Temple of Elemental Evil computer game, and the Temple of Elemental Evil novel. So, you have been warned. The first modules, created and published by TSR for the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game, came in 1978 with the Giants and Drow series and the infamous Tomb of Horrors. These modules ran through a character level range of 8th to 14th, which these days would seem an oddity in that a relatively new game, AD&D began publication in 1977, would begin at such a high mark. There were lower-level offerings from non-TSR sources, and Module B1, In Search of the Unknown, a tutorial module, was also published in 1978 for the basic Dungeons & Dragons set. But for the fledgling advanced game, there was a low-level hole. In order to fill that hole, Gary Gygax picked up an adventure that he had written to aid the transition of new players and characters into his Greyhawk campaign, to bring them up to speed with the stalwart veterans of the milieu. And so, Module T1, The Village of Homlet, came to print in 1979, depicting a pleasant rural settlement with a resurgent evil growing on its doorstep. Within this module, the player characters come to investigate a nearby ruin, once an outpost of an edifice of evil further to the north. As with many of the early Dungeons & Dragons modules, the module describes the current status of the locations it covers, the village and the moat house ruin, some choice protagonists and antagonists that the characters might interact with, and then hands the whole over to the Dungeon Master to weave his players in. There is no specific plot, other than the denizens of the moat house are part of an effort to rebuild evil in the area, and that certain agents of evil had infiltrated the village. From that starting point, it is up to the players and the DM to forge their own tale. The module promised a follow-up to describe the headquarters of the evil force of which the moat house was a mere teaser, the Temple of Elemental Evil. We are told in the introduction to the Village of Homlet about how the village was once under the domination of the temple's denizens, how the moat house was ruined following the successful assault by the forces of good against the temple, how evil was stamped out, with only the occasional monstrous threat for adventurers to deal with thereafter. Our appetites were whetted. Module T2 would reveal a fitting climax to what began as, essentially, an adventure straight out of the guidance to DMs, a dungeon close to a settlement where characters could resupply and restock. But no temple arrived in 1979. In 1980, further teasers came in the World of Greyhawk folio. Here, we are introduced to the Battle of Emredy Meadows, with a date, 569 Common Year, with the following. The Battle of Emredy Meadows highlights this growing realization of mutual interests. That is, the realms of the good and the free working together against the realms of encroaching evil. Contingents of men-at-arms and cavalry from Feriondi and Veluna, together with the forces of dwarves from the Lort Mills, gnomes from the Cron Hills, and an army of elven archers and spearmen fought valiantly against a vast horde of humanoids, orcs, gnolls, and ogres predominantly, and evil men. The opposing forces met on the grassy field south of the Velvediver River, several leagues below the city of Verbabunk. The allied forces were closing upon the stronghold of the evil creatures, a huge walled fortress known as the Temple of Elemental Evil, not far from the unfortunate village of Homlet, where elven scouts reported that a huge army was approaching from the south. The Marshal of Feriondi, leader of the combined forces, ordered withdrawal northwards to a position scouted earlier. Light cavalry skirmishers were sent out to screen the withdrawal, and no real fighting took place that day. When the order of evil creatures marched forth next dawn, they were confronted by the serried ranks of the allied army. The pikes of Furiondi and Valuna were arrayed so that the flank was secured by the Velvediver. In the centre were the banners of horse, and on the allied left were deployed bands of dwarves and gnomes, with a few units of elven archers placed in the intervals between. The humanoids fell immediately upon the left, while the men in the evil ranks rode to engage the centre and right. The hordes of orcs, gnolls, and ogres thrust aside their hated foes, and rushed to encircle the balance of the allied army. Thus the fatal trap was sprung, for the whole allied army pivoted, squadrons of knights driving into the rear of the onrushing hordes of evil, and squares of elves emerging from the gnarly forest to the left to seal the pocket. Trapped in a pocket, with the band of the Velvediver as their backs, and the human and demi-human army forming the chord of the arc, the packed mass of evil humans and humanoids fought hopelessly. After the great slaughter inflicted, the army went on to besiege the Temple of Elemental Evil, and it fell in a fortnight. The demoness Zugtmoy, or Zugtmoy, was imprisoned in the ruins of that place, with special wards to prevent her escape. Only a few of the wicked leaders of the temple managed to escape, and it is suspected that these individuals were responsible for the subsequent kidnapping and total disappearance of the Prince of Furiondi. All of this told us a few things. That the plots of the promised sequel to the Village of Hamlet were floating around somewhere, that the fall of the temple, from a timeline perspective, that it might involve the rescue of royalty, and that the fall of the temple was actually a fairly recent affair, just 7 years ago, if the folio's in-game publication date of 576 is taken as a campaign starter. These facts were copied over in the Guide to the World of Greyhawk, Volume 3, a catalogue of the land of the Flannes, being the eastern portion of the continent of Ulrich on Oerth, an expansion of the folio that formed part of the World of Greyhawk campaign box set in 1983. It's interesting to note here that in the glossography tome of that set, written by one Pluffet Smedger in 998, a year the official setting has yet to reach in its development, 597 being the final year explored in the official Greyhawk publications, with Expedition to the Ruins of Greyhawk, the Village of Hamlet is provided the code WG1 rather than T1, with WG3 being assigned to the Lost Caverns of Sojkanth, as opposed to S4, and WG4 being assigned to the Forgotten Temple of Tharasdun, which it retained. From that, it should be obvious that the recoding of Greyhawk modules was in the works, with WG2 perhaps being reserved for the Temple of Elemental Evil. Regardless, no temple was forthcoming in 1983 either, and it didn't appear in 1984. But in 1985, however, Dungeon Module T1-4, The Temple of Elemental Evil, by Gary Gygax and Frank Menster, hit the shelves. It was marketed as a super module. This was the first of such adventures released by TSR, followed by A1-4 Scourge of the Slave Lords and GDQ 1-7 Queen of the Spiders in 1986, and I3-5 Desert of Desolation in 1987. B1-9 In Search of Adventure and Realms of Horror in 1987 were also supermodules, but there were more compilations than long-format adventures. As a side note here, the later Scourge of the Slave Lords and Queen of the Spiders were touted as sequels to the Temple of Elemental Evil. However, I do not believe this to have been the plan when the temple was originally published. My reasoning here is twofold. First, the original modules obviously have no such connection. The connection is made purely within the pages of A1-4 and GDQ 1-7. Second, the passage within the Secret History of the Temple from T1-4 reads, in reference to Zugtmoy, having just learned of the sharp check dealt to Lolth in her plans to wreak evil. That, to me, suggests that the plots of Zugtmoy and Ayuz in regards to the temple are set after the events of GDQ 1-7, and the connection of T1-4, A1-4 and GDQ 1-7 attempts to supersede this. In any case, what had happened is that Gygax, with duties on the opposite side of the USA to TSR's main headquarters in relation to the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon, which ran from 1983 to 1985, found himself with little time to deal with much of anything else related to the game. not the least completing promised modules, such as Castle Greyhawk and, of course, the Temple of Elemental Evil. Instead, he handed his notes over to Mensa, who completed the work for the 1985 release. The super module included the village of Homlet in its entirety, reformatted and wrapped with additional introduction that gives a brief overview of the module as a whole. A second village, Nulb, was added in summary, far less detail than Homlet, with only 5 pages to its name. The temple itself takes up the bulk of the adventure, comprising a surface-level ruin and 4 dungeon levels. Modern vernacular describes this as a mega-dungeon, but to my mind, that term far better describes more extensive dungeons, such as Undermountain and Castle Greyhawk. The 4 dungeon levels can each be drawn on 1 page of 5mm graph paper, and to me, the temple is better termed as just a dungeon. Finally, 4 elemental nodes, 1 for each air, earth, fire and water, are described as extension areas to the dungeon. These are described in summary, noting the locations of portals and items the adventurers can collect to aid their successful completion of the adventure, but otherwise they're left to the Dungeon Master to develop. Maps for the super module, as became common with this format, were included in a separate booklet. All of the maps from T1 are here: the village of Homlet, the Inn of the Welcome Wench, the Traders' Establishment, the Church of St. Cuthbert, the Guard Tower, and the surface and dungeon levels for the Moat House. Added are 2 wilderness maps, one an excerpt from the World of Greyhawk main campaign map, and one a zoomed-in detail view showing Homlet, Nulb, and the temple, along with surface ruins of the temple, a ruined tower which is part of that, the 4 dungeon levels of the temple, and the 4 elemental nodes. In all, the adventure is a good one, which can be made better, as most adventures, with further development by the DM, particularly with respect to the wilderness surrounding Homlet, the Moat House, and between Homlet and Nulb. The journeys between these areas can be run in summary, with use of random encounter tables included in the work, but it can be much more rewarding if the fact of a growing threat is brought into sharp focus for the players by making these areas of wilderness increasingly dangerous. Homlet is reasonably developed in the module, but there is a lot of room for the Dungeon Master to add their own particular stamp on it. Nulb needs a lot of work, especially since it is the closest settlement to the temple. It is a potential, if dangerous, home base for the player characters to use as a base, avoiding the trek back to Homlet, especially pressing, if you are implementing a danger escalation within the wilderness areas as the temple gradually re-establishes its presence, until the player characters can do something to curb this. The dungeon is complete, and the only job of the Dungeon Master here is to read through the whole thing and make copious notes on the factions inhabiting it and their relationships with each other. These make the dungeon more than just a slog. They are set up to be living, breathing workplaces for factions striving to bring elemental evil back in the world. The elemental nodes are another area where DM work can be done, but this is not too necessary. Although the information regarding the nodes is fairly sparse, the non-player characters that travel them, coupled with the random encounter charts and the alterations to spell effects within each node, do bring enough of a challenge should you decide to just wing it. They are not complex areas. Additionally, they are not even certain areas. It is highly useful for the player characters to visit and retrieve the treasures each contains, but not absolutely necessary. And there is no guarantee that the characters will end up there. I've found that keeping the nodes open and flexible also allows you to tailor them on the fly to the condition of the player characters at the points that they find themselves there. Do too much work here, and you run the danger of limiting that flexibility. In any case, the nodes make an on-theme, interesting extension to the temple's dungeons. All in all, the Temple of Elemental Evil, as originally presented, is a campaign in its own right, with clearly defined bad guy motives, a hierarchy of enemies to defeat as the plot thickens and the player characters evolve, and a whole area to play with that can play a part as the story unfolds. My advice is to familiarise yourself with the personages and the minions that they have at hand, and don't fall into the temptation of running it as a linear Homlet to Moat House to Nulb to Temple railroad journey. Add foreshadowing. Describe a timetable for the Temple's forces, perhaps escalating as the Temple leaders begin to realise that they have an adventuresome forces arrayed against them. If the characters use Nulb as a base camp, it can become an increasingly dangerous place to use to rest and recuperate as the Temple's influence grows stronger there. Or perhaps things go the other way as the player characters drive the evil factions out of this otherwise seedy village, maybe with the help of such allies as they might find on the way. In 2001, the Temple was revisited by means of the Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil adventure, written by Monty Cook for Wizards of the Coast's 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. This module altered the focus from being a front scheme organisation for the demoness Sugtamoy and her allies to those dark individuals being mere pawns of the deity Tharsden. This plot meshes into the events of GDQ 1-7 further, with the Elder Elemental Eye, the power worshipped by the Isleservs in the Queen of the Spiders adventure, being a rival of Lolth, and the struggles between these two factions of Drow being part and parcel of the old D series of modules. This new true history of the Temple also goes some way to explain the presence of the Lolth worshipper Lareth in the Moat House from the original. With the Return adventure, the player characters arrive at an expanded Homlet, now grown to town size, with a completed castle. And here lies my first issue with the adventure, as Homlet is one of the worst maps laid out for a town in an adventure that I have ever seen. The contours have apparently been flattened, and there is little to recognise the buildings of the original village beyond their numerically keyed entries. It does not evoke the original at all, not even suggesting it is the old place now grown. The Return module then progresses on to the next familiar location of the original, the Moat House. Here we are told that Lareth was actually a secret follower of Tharsden, with his worship of Lolth a mere sham. We are also given insight into why the location was chosen for the construction of the Moat House. An ancient shrine to Tharsden existed on the site. Below the Moat House, what we once knew as a simple pool with a giant crayfish, there now lurks a giant obelisk that the followers of Tharsden have been working to excavate over a period following the events of T1-4. And a dragon now inhabits the upper works of the Moat House. From the Moat House, the player characters can gain clues that will lead them to the Temple and outline some of the factional tensions there. And so it's on to the next point down the road, the village of Nulb. Nulb itself is a ghost town, fallen into ruin. This is perhaps understandable, but again, I have to criticise the map of the place. Even in its black and white unglory, the original map of Nulb and Homlet are far better drawn. Colour and drop shadows do not always make a map more useful to a dungeon master. Within Nulb, the characters may encounter a changed Lareth, who, we are informed, is now the plot point in the railroad that this Return to sequel is. And so, on to the Temple it is. The upper ruins of the Temple are now inhabited with hobgoblins and goblins. The next part of the story takes us to the Temple of All Consumption, which the player characters may have picked up information on, notably from random encounters. This temple is huge, and a main edifice of the cult of Tharsden. Harkening back to the excesses of James Bond movies, it is set within a volcano, with the main parts of the dungeon encircling the volcano's crater. Regardless, the player characters might head off to this temple, or might just remain at the ruined temple's location, and try to work out what's going on there first. This, I think, is a weak point in the linear arc that the adventure portrays. The plot suggests that the characters go from the upper ruins of the original temple to the Temple of All Consumption, and then back to the original temple for something of a showdown. In any case, we find ourselves returned to the Temple of Elemental Evil and into the partially excavated dungeons of that place, the dungeons having previously collapsed as part of the original adventure's run or during the intervening period. Here, the cult of Tharisdun is attempting to return their deity into the world, using the princes of elemental evil to channel power to him to enable his escape. Using, of course, the mega artifact from which the Orb of the Golden Death from the original module is merely patterned as a lesser copy. Well. Anyway, the cultists are partway through this plot, and it remains up to the adventurers and whatever allies they have picked up on the way to defeat the plan. Now, in general, I do not have a problem with revisits to older dungeons. The modules Return to the Keep on the Borderlands and Return to White Plume Mountain are okay. Return to the Tomb of Horrors is somewhat of a railroad, but it has some nice touches to it, especially the town of necromancers grown up around the tomb, and some reasoning as to why Acererak made the tomb that way in the first place. But with Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, I feel that too much has been done to try and outdo the original. Bigger temple, more powerful artifact, bigger stakes in not simply preventing the rise of an evil cult, but the freedom of the biggest evil god Greyhawk has to offer. More, higher, Uber! And in this regard, it makes the whole thing a mess. Certain things we know to be true from the original are no longer true here. For example, with Zuggtmoy being slain on the prime material plane in the original, the elemental nodes should have been nullified. If Zuggtmoy is slain, the connections of the dungeons to the nodes vanish, and the nodes do likewise. Well, in the Return module, the nodes still exist, and still have their, albeit deactivated, connections to the dungeons. Only the Fire node has been reconnected and plays a part in this adventure, unless the DM wishes to do some development of the rest. So not only does the Return go for broke in one-upmanship stakes, but it also retcons or outright ignores much from the original module. Anyway, my gripes on what is a huge railroad, that depends on some very tenuous links to keep its parts together, and that, in its quest for hugeness, produces one of the most potentially boring dungeon crawls ever committed to paper. And mentioning again the terrible depiction of a grown-up Homlet, the Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil was voted the 8th greatest Dungeons & Dragons adventure of all time, behind the original temple in 4th place. And for me, however, it's a bloated dud. Along the same time as the Return module, a novel was published by Wizards of the Coast, written by Thomas M. Reed as part of their Greyhawk Classics line, which included novelizations of Against the Giants, Keep on the Borderlands, The Tomb of Horrors and others. As far as novel based on game goes, it's not bad. It's readable, not challenging, probably good for a long rail journey or a flight. It recounts Reed's own group's expedition to the temple, omitting certain aspects of that adventure and of the module due to page-length restrictions placed by Wizards of the Coast across the whole series. Before we go on to the recent Goodman Games release, there is one more temple mention to make. In 2003, Troika Games and Atari released a computer game version of the Temple of Elemental Evil. This game implemented the 3.5 edition of the Dungeons & Dragons rules and was horribly broken when first released. However, with patches and fan-made mods, the game has grown to be a fantastic play. It relatively faithfully recreates the original temple module, expands on Nulb, the elemental nodes, and the wilderness around Homlet and the temple itself, and is damn good fun to play. In general, the interface to this game is reminiscent of both the Baldur's Gate and the Neverwinter Nights games. Having played through the thing to completion several times now, I can absolutely recommend giving it a go, especially if you are a dungeon master wanting inspiration in fleshing out the module, particularly Nulb, which can be a lot of fun. Now we arrive at Original Adventures Reincarnated Volume 6, The Temple of Elemental Evil. Goodman have pulled the stops out for this one, producing a hefty 2-volume slipcase, effectively doubling the space of the previous adventures in this series. The 2 volumes are split into Volume 1, which encompasses the usual monologues, interviews, and reprints the first 5 sections of the 5th edition conversion: Homlet, the Moat House, the Wilderness region, Nulb, and the upper ruins of the temple. Volume 2 continues with the 4 dungeon levels of the temple, the elemental nodes, and the appendices covering new monsters, spells, magic items, non-player characters, player handouts, and so on. You might think that 2 volumes is excessive, but I don't find this to be the case. More than half of Volume 1 is taken up with the scan of the original T1 and T1 to 4 modules, and I don't believe that they could have done the adventure anything approaching justice with the pages left to them within a single volume after that. The monologues are, as usual, superfluous. There are 3 that describe Goodman staffers' experiences with the original modules, complete with photos of them as kids. I feel exactly the same about these as I did about similar in previous OAR volumes. They are not relevant. They seem to serve no particular purpose other than to feed some egos. More on point and of greater interest are a couple of essays that explore the development of Hamlet and the Temple, which make very interesting reads. How such adventures were developed and where their original seeds came from is very fitting for a homage volume. An interview with Jeff Easley is included, which is a fun read, particularly with respect to Easley's sense of humour. I would have liked to have seen an interview with Frank Menzer here too, as a surviving author of the work, and because we have yet to see Frank appearing in an OAR volume. Ahead of the original scans in Volume 1, there are a few pages describing corrections to the original that Goodman authors have considered and have worked into their conversion. This was an interesting read for me. Many of the errors in this section highlights I have long since corrected in my own copies of the originals, but there were a few that I hadn't noticed or registered before. But then again, all dungeon masters of a certain vintage that played published modules did acquire the skill of glossing over inconsistencies and errors on the fly, so perhaps they were dealt with the in-game and never made it into my penciled corrections and notes. We are talking over 35 years ago for my first run-throughs of the Temple, and over 20 years since I last ran the module, so memory and all that. Regardless, many of the notes presented here will be added to my original, on the off chance that I Dungeon Mastered them again within their native Dungeons & Dragons edition. The module scans are, as we have come to expect, very clear and complete. The scans presented are the 3rd printing of T1, the Village of Hamlet, and the 3rd printing of T1 to 4, the Temple of Elemental Evil. Scans of the 7th printing of the village are included. The original T1 had an orange-black cover, while later printings had a green cover with colour illustrations. The gatefold map of the village is included in a fold-out double page, and the map booklet for the temple is reproduced in full page form. The original booklet used a smaller page size. Following the reprints, the Goodman 5th edition conversion begins. We are presented with a bit of an overview of Greyhawk, a summary of the adventure in general, and some play notes for Dungeon Masters. Of these, I find myself cringing at the space given over to the balancing of encounters. You see, in the conversion, Goodman have opted to retain the encounters as written, monster numbers and so on. However, 5th edition philosophy calls for a more balanced approach with respect to character party power versus encounter difficulty. This is one of the aspects of encounter design from 3rd edition on that I am not in tune with. For me, an encounter should make sense within the context of the adventure first and foremost. It is up to the players to deal with it as they see fit, including avoiding action or clever use of tactics if it appears to be too strong for them, if a more direct path would be taken. Balancing encounters, I think, is somewhat of an inheritance from video games. In that medium, the very broad range of options tabletop players can dream up is simply not present, and so a certain amount of balancing must be done to make the computer game playable. When a large amount of balancing is done to encounters within a tabletop medium, the impetus to think through an encounter becomes diminished, scouting ahead almost irrelevant. Players come to expect such balancing, and therefore become lazier in their approach to handling challenges set before them. This, I feel, detracts from the gaming experience. Your mileage may vary, of course, and I can understand what the Goodman folks are talking about in this section. It just isn't for me, and I expect more brainwork from the players at my table. The notes on balancing treasures are, however, well taken. The coinage from 1st edition perspective does not translate well to 5th edition. The former imposing costs for character advancement as well as awarding experience points for recovered treasures. Without such elements in 5th edition, the amount of treasure acquired can just make characters very rich indeed. So onwards, a prequel encounter is added, which might provide some additional clues to the moat house. The village of Homlet itself appears to have been little tampered with, other than conversion and the addition of some odds and sods to make a 5th edition Dungeon Master's life slightly easier. The village map is on a fold-out double page, which, unlike the similar map from OAR 5, Castle Amber, does not have text on the outer reverse leaf. This is much better. A section on random villager names is presented, which can be helpful to those that haven't already fleshed out Homlet with the family trees, and inter-family relationships and so on. Yes, some of us are that anal. After that, it's on to the moat house. As with Homlet, little has been added here. I was half expecting material from the Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil modules to be referenced, but thankfully it has not. Lareth remains a servant of Lolth, and the employee of the temple, and that is that. The wilderness area is described next, with some new encounter areas and lairs. Some are reminiscent of the computer game, so the Goodman authors may have taken this as a partial influence. Some are connected to the plot of the temple, and others are entirely separate. Whichever the case, they fill up the whole nicely, and can even spark some side quests to explore. Nulb is next, and benefits from an expansion, although not as extreme as the one it received for the computer game. The original village locations are present, and some additional ones added that give more flavour to the place. The upper works of the temple appear in the final chapter of Volume 1 and are a like-for-like conversion. The book is finished off by collecting the maps used within this first volume. Volume 2 follows on immediately from Volume 1, diving straight into the first dungeon level of the temple. The conversion of each dungeon level follow Goodman's usual fare for converting and cleaning and represent some solid work. In addition, each chapter is prefaced with notes on scaling the respective dungeon level to suit the expected party character levels for that stage of the adventure. These notes cover alterations to specific rooms, either in the number of monsters there or the nature of the monsters encountered. Also, as I noted earlier, Goodman has taken the time to introduce corrections to the maps, key numbers and descriptive text where they have identified problems. It is actually within the dungeon level descriptions that most of the errors of the original temple module appear, so it is here that most of the corrective work has been done. Following on from the dungeon levels are the chapters detailing the elemental nodes. It is within these that the bulk of Goodman's expansion work has been done. In the original adventure, the encounter locations within the nodes were simply listed, a key reference plus one or two brief sentences describing what can be found at that location. Within the OAR conversion, these key references are expanded into full encounter entries, complete with read-aloud sections and details for the Dungeon Master. These extensions build upon the lists of the areas for each node, so that they can't be said to be absolutely new material, but the fleshing out of those areas does make for a useful and welcome content. When I have run the temple in the past, the nodes have always been treated as simple extensions, with the definite purpose of retrieving the gems of power. With Goodman's expansions here, the nodes take on more life, and are the better for it. Finally, the appendices referenced by both volumes round out the work. As in the original, Appendix A deals with deities, except no summary of the Greyhawk pantheon appears here, and while the appendix covers Euz and St. Cuthbert, as did the original, Zugtmoy is moved here from her original location within the Monsters appendix, which makes sense. Appendix B describes some pre-generated player characters, which is an addition to the original. Non-player character statistics appear in this second section of Appendix B, and some generic stat blocks are included here that are useful to any campaign beyond the Temple of Adventure itself. I feel that the named NPC stats would have been more successfully organised by location rather than alphabetically, both from an adventure preparation and an in-play perspective. But at least there is an order here. Appendix C covers new monsters, most of which are from first edition sources that have yet to see official updates. There are some iconic monsters in this section, which I remain surprised as not having been included in a 5th edition source to date. Appendix D includes new magic items and spells, and again, many have been drawn from older sources, converted over in this volume to remain faithful to the original adventure. It's nice to see the cloak of poisonousness here, which caused much hilarity within the scope of the black humour that frequented our gaming groups back in the day. Appendix E comprises a number of handouts for players and for the Dungeon Master. A nice summary of the inhabitants of Homlet is here, as well as useful handouts for players. A number of these depict maps that are alluded to in the text of the adventure, and it's nice that Goodman elected to produce handouts for the players to illustrate these. Appendix F2 collects the maps referenced in Volume 2. The similar map collection from Volume 1 is noted as Appendix F1. And that is followed by Appendix G, a glossary of words that people should know but that, for some reason, the authors believe to be archaic enough to need explanation. Volume 1 notes, Messrs. Gygax and Mensa, the original authors, often use esoteric terms and descriptions when designing adventures in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This 5th edition conversion attempts to remain true to the original prose, although it is updated for the modern gamer. Therefore, the reader is directed to Appendix G, a glossary of uncommon terms used throughout this book, with which the DM or the players might not be familiar. Okay, well and good, but when such terms as battlement and dais and decanter and hubris and potable and surcoat and verdigris, to note but a few, are all deemed as esoteric, especially within the scope of a pseudo-medieval fantasy game, I do worry. I also feel that such glossaries and the mention of authors using esoteric terms are not particularly useful things to include. The elders among us are perfectly capable dictionary users, and for those not so inclined, there is always something like Wikipedia. The Temple of Elemental Evil is one of those edifices that is writ large upon the landscape of Dungeons and Dragons. Even if you are relatively new to the game, you may still have heard of it. It remains an illustration of what a campaign module can aspire to, a collection of locations with an underpinning plot into which the player characters are thrust and must find their way through. It does not railroad. It does not present a mindless slog through endless dungeon rooms. The main dungeon itself is a living, breathing thing with multiple factions that clever players can play off to their advantage. Homlet and the Moat House work well to introduce new players to the game, while not boring veteran players in the same way that some introductory adventures can do. All in all, the original Temple adventure was well conceived, and, as ever, Goodman have done a sterling job in their homage and conversion. If you want some additional Temple fun, the Atari computer game version is available for less than £5 at just under $6 at today's conversion rate on GOG.com. The novel by Reed is available on Kindle and on Audible. If you want to kill a couple of hours or so on something that won't challenge you but shouldn't overly disappoint you, I'd steer clear of the Return To module as a hot mess, but your mileage may vary there. As a final aside, the Princes of the Apocalypse adventure, published by Wizards of the Coast for 5th edition, draws upon the foundation of the Temple of Elemental Evil. Now that a good conversion of the original temple is out there, it may be an idea to bring the two together, perhaps using the temple as a prelude, maybe with different set of adventurers. There are some notes towards the end of the Prince's volume that summarise how the locations of the original module and the Prince's adventure might be combined. I would add to this by perhaps considering bringing some of the elements of the Prince's adventure in when you run the original Temple adventures, converted or not. For example, the differences between the air, earth, fire and water cults, as described in the Prince's volumes, are much more fleshed out and unique than they are in the original, and this can only add to the flavour of the campaign. So that has been my overview of the various incarnations of the Temple of Elemental Evil adventures. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful in one way or another. As a footnote, along with all the usual urgings to subscribe, like, share, turn notifications on and all that, I'd like to extend a very heartfelt personal thank you to everyone that has dropped a tip or picked up a subscription to my Subscribestar. I don't make money from my videos, and they do take a chunk of time and effort to put together, so anything coming through from you guys through Subscribestar or whatever is humbly and graciously received, and I thank you. Along with more random music, craft, knots and whatever, the next up on the gaming front, I think, will be a review of Traveller, The New Era. That is, unless I figure out a good way to put some solo gaming videos together first. In any case, thank you for watching, and until the next time.